Hello there. Welcome to my channel. This is part 1 in a series dealing with the concept of rights. In this video, I explain how there is no secular justification for human rights theory. Without a religious framing, human rights theory breaks down. The video primarily critiques the UN's human rights theory because the UN is the primary body of human rights law. However, nearly all criticisms of the UN in this regard are applicable to those who defend the concept of human rights in general. It may focus on the UN as an example, but the critiques are general. In the script for this video, it's a slightly modified essay I wrote for university. If it sounds very academic, it was originally meant to be. If I made this specifically for a video, I would change some of the phrasing and sourcing. As it is, I don't think it's worth the time. In future, they should be better. I am also likely to butcher names foreign to me. I apologize. The UN is a very diverse organization. The orthodoxy of our age is rights talk. The notion of human rights is not only dominant in discourse, it actually forms the foundation for international law. This foundation rests on very tenuous grounds, and I do not think it an exaggeration to say that most of the scholarly and philosophical work on the topic is nothing more than a wordy paraphrase of the 1993 Vienna Declaration. Quote, "The universal nature of these rights and freedoms is beyond question." I would like to ask some questions, but before I do so, I wish to make clear that my rejection of the concept of human rights does not mean I reject its goals. I, too, want people to live good lives. I may not believe in the human right to free speech, but I do believe in free speech. The standard critique of the universality of human rights is most elegantly expressed in one of its original forms. During the drafting of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, the American Anthropological Association sent a letter outlining their concerns. They objected to the possibility of universality on the basis that, quote, "Standards and values are relative to the culture from which they derive, so that any attempt to formulate postulates that grow out of the moral codes or beliefs of one culture must, to that extent, detract from the applicability of any declaration of human rights to mankind as a whole." We might call this the relativist objection. The letter arose in the context of many nations' exclusion from the UN. There was a concern that many non-Western peoples, especially those under colonial rule, would not have their perspectives and interests represented in the UDHR. While this concern was undoubtedly justified, literature I read did not find the relativist critique especially compelling. Values are undeniably relative, but that does not mean nothing is universal. As Thoreau, former Undersecretary General of the United Nations, says, quote, "Universality does not presuppose uniformity." Notions of dignity are different in Ohio and Indonesia. Both peoples value dignity. Given this, we might make a distinction between strong relativism and weak relativism. Strong relativism is the claim that, since values are culturally relative, there are no values universally held by all mankind. Weak relativism is the claim that, given that values are culturally relative, there are no values both universally held and universally understood. Strong relativism is evidently false, as every single person on the planet values not being tortured, for if they valued it, it would not be torture. These sorts of things are very close to tautologies. Weak relativism is self-evidently true. After all, language itself is not understood universally, and even within a given culture, values never are. That's why we need lawyers to interpret things like the wording of laws and judges who determine whose rights trump whose, and so on. Weak relativism undermines human rights in two separate but equally important ways. Firstly, the justification of human rights is not a priori universal. That is, we cannot derive its universal nature from pure reason alone. We must look to empirical evidence, namely human nature. However, the nature of human rights is such that there is no such empirical evidence, and it cannot even be possible to get it. Secondly, the nature of human rights renders them generally incapable of actually achieving their primary goals. Part 1, Dignity. In his book, The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Origins, Drafting, and Intent, Maureen explains that the drafters of the UDHR were repulsed by the atrocities, particularly the concentration camps of World War II. They were convinced that as representatives of the world, they needed to articulate universal human rights as a way to express the world's conscience. The drafters were diplomats representing a wide array of countries with a wide array of perspectives. However, given the variety of perspectives, they disagreed on many issues. However, they could all agree on certain don'ts. Novak, former UN ambassador to the UN Commission on Human Rights, summarized this well, quote, "Having seen the awful consequences of a world without universal standards, they were now ready to agree about certain practices that must not be done, not ever again." End quote. You might say that the drafter saw a different path to heaven, but the same path to hell. In his article, The Concept of Dignity in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Professor Hughes outlines that even though they shared a common end, the diverse visions and values of the drafters meant, quote, its International Bill of Rights would have to employ a language that was eminently practical rather than theoretical, a language that avoided all metaphysical and religious formulations. In order to avoid commenting on the nature of man and limited by the practical knowledge, the drafters justified human rights by appealing to dignity. This is suggested in Article 1 of the UDHR and eventually made explicit in later declarations, with the Vienna Declaration saying, quote, all human rights derive from the dignity and worth inherent in the human person. Dignity is a Western term. It derives from the Latin dignitas. Hughes explains how even though, quote, the drafters of the Universal Declaration embraced the word as representing a concept both universally understandable and corresponding to equivalent words or ideas in non-Western cultures. Quote, the concept of dignity in the UDHR is inexplicably rooted in Enlightenment ideals in the Christian tradition. We can see this when Nina, in our article, Are Human Rights Universal or Culturally Relative, explicitly defines dignity as a reference to, quote, the universal aspiration that all humans are entitled to be treated with respect, as ends rather than means, to be recognized as of equal worth, and to be permitted to advance their gifts. The influence of Christianity in Western philosophy is undeniable. The idea of treating people as ends rather than means is the direct rehash of the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. In short, the way we talk about human rights is dependent on, quote, the Christian vision of a human person as being capable of personal freedom and as having incalculable worth, end quote. Hughes. Even though the drafters recognized the Christian roots of the term, they chose to leave its grounding unexpressed because they felt that the term worked without historical and religious reference. It is true that the term can function without direct reference to Christianity, but that doesn't mean it isn't derivative from Christianity. And the drafters may have chosen not to mention religion, but the UDHR reflects a spiritual foundation. During the drafting process, a disagreement arose over whether to use the term person or individual. The controversy arose in the context of the Cold War. The United States wanted individual as a slight against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union resolutely rejected the term because the United States insisted that the individual was prior to the state. The term person was adopted as a compromise. They settled on person because, quote, a cat or a dog, even a tree, can be an individual, but only a human being can be a person. What makes a person, rather more than merely an individual, is a spiritual capacity, the capacity to choose and reflect, to be imaginative and creative, to be an originating source of action, end quote, Novick. While the above quote may seem to suggest that the important aspect of a person is being an originating source of action rather than spiritual capacity, describing the defining characteristics of a person as their spiritual capacity was not accidental. Persons won support from the more communitarian faction of the drafters, based on the arguments that persons are social beings who participate in whole networks of kin, neighborhood, religious tradition, and other immediate associations, natural and civil, and through those relations live out a thick social identity. Novak. This implies that what separates people from animals is at least in part the capacity for spiritual thought. An observer listener might have noticed a strong similarity to the notion that man was created in God's image. An even more observant listener may have noticed how the concept of personhood has been extending to non-humans, and so has the idea of rights. There are now somewhat successful efforts by environmentalists to get the rights of nature enshrined in law. Part 2, Human. There are many more aspects of human rights that are grounded in religious notions. However, I will restrict myself to the notion of human. The importance of the previous 2 points is they show that human rights are grounded in a theistic worldview. While it is true that human rights thus far can be understood in a secular manner, any secular ethic breaks down when discussing who is human. I have found that almost no works defining human rights take the time to explain what a human is. The UDHR neglects to do this, and the systematic failure of the doctrine is of utmost consequences. Unfortunately, the history of human rights is one of the persistent failure to prevent the most severe instances of human rights violation: genocide and ethnic cleansing. This failure is baked into the doctrine itself. Besides the lack of any meaningful enforcement mechanisms, the perpetrators of genocide never see their victims as human. During the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, the famous American philosopher Richard Rorty noted that during the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, quote, the Serbian murderers and rapists do not think of themselves as violating human rights, for they were not doing these things to fellow human beings, but to Muslims. In my personal experience, I once had to leave a discussion with a group of students at my uni for having the gumption to say that fascists are still people and therefore have human rights. For human rights to actually mean anything, they need to have a way to convince the Serbs that the Bosnians are human. This point is crucial. While it is wonderful that everyone else thinks the Bosnians are human, what mattered in 1995 was the beliefs of the Serbs. It didn't matter what Deborah in Ohio thought of the Jews in 1943, what matters was what the Germans thought. In short, if human rights doctrine is fundamentally incapable of reaching those who would violate human rights, it is useless. If the doctrine cannot justify why the Bosnians are humans, or why the Uyghur Muslims are humans, or why the Jews are humans, what is the point of human rights? I think this is by far the weakest area of human rights. Considering the drafters were motivated by the aftermath of genocide, the empathy of human rights in the face of it is damning. Not only do proponents of human rights lack any possible response to the Serb, they don't even have a coherent concept themselves. The philosopher Michael Perry tries to address this when he takes on the relativist challenge in Are Human Rights Universal? The Relativist Challenge in Related Matters. I applaud him for beginning by defending the claim that all humans are sacred, but I am disappointed in the results. He begins by noting that some people claim that not all persons are human beings. For example, the Serbs did not consider the Bosnians human. Perry's response is to reformulate this as, quote, only some human beings are sacred. He does this on the basis that all Homo sapiens are human. Setting aside his definition of human, I think it is quite useful to posit the issue in terms of sacredness, but he only rewords the problem. He goes on to expend a great deal of energy trying to defend the idea that all humans are sacred. In other words, all human persons are sacred humans. He discusses various arguments like the idea that humans intrinsically care for other humans, but finds them all lacking. He concludes with admirable honesty that there is no, quote, intelligible secular version of the conviction that every human being is sacred, end quote. He then presupposes that all human beings are sacred and continues with his refutation of the relativist. Perry bit off more than he could chew and spat it out to avoid choking. This is by no means a criticism of Perry himself. He at least had the courage to try the food. Most others cannot even be found at the table. This obstacle, explaining in secular terms why all persons are human enough to have human rights, was created by the drafters of the UDHR and the origins of human rights theory. They wanted to avoid any comments on the metaphysical nature of humans or any religious justifications. Their reasoning was understandable. For the UDHR to be accepted, it had to be secular. But as Welker says, without any definitional substance or solid explanation, dignity is an empty formula, an illusion. Ironically, it is by asserting that dignity is inherent to all that the UDHR provides a mechanism to sidestep human rights. The provisions in the UDHR that are designed to prevent people from being excluded from human rights rest on the idea that dignity is inherent. It is independent of social recognition, personal achievements, the capacity to exercise freedom of will, rational understanding, moral deciding, and creative self-definition. Glenn Hughes explained that because inherent dignity is inherent, it must be part of the essence of a human. I know this is a tautology, but please bear with it. Therefore, quote, in order for the concept of inherent dignity to make philosophical sense, there must indeed be a human nature. If there is a human nature, then there must be something essential to human beings as such, and something essential to human beings must, by definition, transcend differences of culture, biology, and history. This explanation of why we have inherent dignity is illustrative, but it explains little. It explains little because it is a rather roundabout way of saying, quote, humans have inherent dignity because the nature of humans is such that they have inherent dignity. But it does an excellent job of illustrating the incoherence of this position. However, Hughes' explanation is useful in that it shows us about how to think about human rights. It shows us that this sacred something is to be found in our nature. The thing that renders a person sacred, a human, is his or her nature. It is universal, and so human rights are universal. This makes sense, but it cannot function under a secular worldview. I would also love to hear someone who denies that there is such thing as human nature, as many people nowadays are wont to do, explain how humans can have inherent dignity. Part 3. Homo sapiens as humanity. As with Perry, many people hold the idea that human is equivalent to Homo sapien. But this nature cannot simply be attributed to the species. There's nothing about being a Homo sapien that endows inherent dignity. On a naturalistic worldview, if there is human nature, it is a product of evolution by natural selection. However, evolution cannot produce a sacred creature. Evolution is a phenomenon resulting from selection pressures. Evolution alone renders human beings no more sacred than a crab. Further, humans do not actually believe that it is our species which makes us special. Nobody claims their Homo sapien rights. It would be ridiculous to imagine Amnesty International publishing a report of the status of Homo sapien rights. The idea that human rights and Homo sapien rights do not mean the same thing strongly suggests that they are not identical. The human nature is reminiscent of the ancient idea of the soul. A soul is, in simplified form, the immaterial essence, animating principle, or actuating cause of an individual's life, according to Merriam-Webster. But I don't like to, appeal to the dictionary, but we're just going to go ahead and do that. In fact, I see no meaningful distinction between the two. I think the most important part is, quote, immaterial essence. Human nature is the essence of a human because, quote, it belongs to human existence essentially. Again, that was Hughes. The fact that this human nature is immaterial arises out of the understanding of the word inherent in the UDHR. As previously stated, it is independent of social recognition, personal achievements, the capacity to exercise freedom of will, rational understanding, moral deciding, and creative self-definition. Given this, there is no avenue for it to be material. It cannot be a mental faculty, a genetic factor, a behavioral or personality trait, etc. Notice that we still haven't produced a method for discerning who is human, who is sacred. The reason being, no such method exists. Since inherent dignity is just a secular version of a soul, a person is a human if they have the soul. Given that the soul is by definition immaterial, there's no way we can actually determine who has one and who doesn't. This explains why Perry had to spit. He bit off something indigestible. Part 4. Universality. None of this is a surprise. We should not expect a doctrine that arose out of Christianity to function properly without it. As Hughes makes clear, quote, all the drafters would have been aware of the 20th century ideals and principles of the liberal democratic order, and human rights were deeply indebted to the Christian idea of a human being as a person gifted with inalienable dignity through her creative participation in the freedom and self-determination of a transcendent God. End quote. Hughes begins by recognizing the importance of Christianity to human rights, but then tries to show how they may operate without Christianity. But they don't. Human rights are inseparable from a Christian ethic, but more importantly, a Christian metaphysics. The most obvious example of this is Article 2 in the UDHR. Article 2 states that, quote, everyone is entitled to the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, natural or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Article 7 is quite similar, reading, quote, all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. This notion of equality is historically Western. The Judeo-Christian concept of imago Dei, I don't know, it's Latin, as made in, quote, in the image and likeness of God, was fundamental to the modern notion of equality. In the Christian tradition, all men are equal under God. Over time, especially during this Enlightenment, this also evolved into equality under the law. Unfortunately, human rights Christians' roots do not grow into a universal tree. We need look no further than India's caste system. Whereas equality under the law entails the prohibition of preferences given to people based on their age, gender, ethnicity, etc., the caste system systematically entrenches such preferences. Alongside the caste system, we may add beliefs about marriage in Saudi Arabia, communities in Asia and Africa who deny the right to private ownership of land, and many, many others. Basically, everyone who isn't from Europe and the European tradition. The challenges these cultures present is that which the American Anthropological Association made clear. Any attempt to formulate postulates that grow out of the beliefs or moral codes of one culture must, to that extent, detract from the applicability of human rights to mankind as a whole. Human rights grew out of the moral beliefs of the Christian West. These postulates that relate to things like equality, private property, and certain types of individual freedoms are not fully applicable to mankind as a whole. Standard responses to this argument illustrate the importance of weak relativism. Perry argues for the idea of human nature. They are some things that all humans need: a place in a community, assistance during hardship, etc. Because of these common human goods, we can construct a metric for human flourishing that is transcultural. There are two problems with this position. First, the fact that there are common human goods does not mean that there are common human nature. That all humans need food cannot ground human nature. After all, almost all basic human needs like food, water, shelter, even affection and community are shared by some animals. Second, at best, Perry's critique only addresses strong relativism. I am willing to say that all mankind values food. Once again, strong relativism is obviously false. However, weak relativism is still untouched. Yes, everyone values having food to eat, but not everyone will eat the same food. It is not enough that people agree on a specific value. They must also have a similar understanding of that value for it to be universal in any meaningful sense. In the movie Finding Nemo, there's a memorable scene where a group of sharks hold the mantra, "Fish are friends, not food." If a group of normal predatory sharks swam into their territory and attempted to eat their friends, peace between the groups would not be achieved by saying, "All sharks value food." Details matter. A lot. I find Thoreau's response to the relativist objection in Human Rights Are Universal interesting, because it's one of the few that actually dealt with the differences in how people understand their rights. Additionally, it is closely tied to classical liberalism, and so is a perspective quite likely amenable to many Westerners. He asks on what basis we may reject female circumcision, child marriage, and other highly contentious human rights issues. He claims that we can make an objective judgment by referring to standards of coercion. These are human rights violations not because of the act in themselves, but because they necessitate coercion, and no appeal to tradition can justify coercion. This reasoning is extremely ethnocentric. First, it is a clear derivation of the Lockean liberalism. It is not clear why a culture It is not clear why a culture which does not think coercion is inherently bad should be obligated to adopt this standard. If we go back to the example of India's caste system, it clearly entails coercion, and they clearly aren't bothered by this. This response is just another case of a postulate grown out of a specific culture which is not applicable to mankind as a whole. Similarly, the judgment of what kind of coercion matters is completely arbitrary and undoubtedly ethnocentric. I doubt Thoreau would argue that all mention of property rights in the UDHR should be disregarded. Any system of private property requires private property rights to be enforced. The coercion that is inherent to the system would be rejected in many places, like in Africa and Asia, who deny private property rights altogether. It seems that there can be no objective standard to evaluate competing cultural claims, for, just like the coercion standard, any argument about why the standard should be adopted will be rooted in specific cultural norms, not shared by those you are arguing with. It can be argued that the truth of human rights can be derived from a secular philosophy, in a manner similar to something like Kantian ethics. I don't think Kant actually derives secular ethics, but let us suppose that some deontological moral system can be derived from secular grounds. The problems are far from over, and let us further suppose that we somehow derive a secular human nature that conveniently includes dignity. Human rights theory is still bunk. An honest explanation of such a theory would go, based on the cultural values I've inherited, such as the supremacy of human reason, I have derived an ethical system which can be accepted cross-culturally and is universally applicable to mankind. To which the Native Americans, or basically every other culture, responds, quote, I reject the supremacy of human reasoning over other forms of knowledge. This is mysticism, testimony, divine revelation, experience, etc. I also don't think humans have dignity in the particular meaning of the word as you use it. And to which yet another group responds, quote, excellent, I quite like this moral framework, but X group aren't human and so don't have human rights. And to which yet another group responds, wow, what a great philosophy. But I think it's a violation of human dignity to leave young girls with their clitoral hood. Decent women are circumcised. To all of these human rights theorists, To all of these objections, the human rights theorist has nothing meaningful to say.
Somewhere over there by the sapphire sea, the whispering palm trees are calling me to skies ever blue there alone.